Have you ever watched someone just completely master a complex new skill in a matter of weeks, while other people spend years just struggling to get off the starting block? It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Is this rapid mastery just a result of some innate, unteachable intelligence? Or is there actually a hidden mechanics to learning? A specific set of methods that literally anyone can adopt. Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to completely dismantle everything you thought you knew about how humans actually acquire new skills. And the core thesis we're exploring today is honestly incredibly empowering. Basically, according to the science of skill acquisition, your learning speed is determined primarily by your method. It is not about your natural ability. So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the myth of innate talent, then move through the literal biology of skill, break down the deliberate practice framework, look at some retention hacks, learn how to build better mental models, and finish up with the absolute ultimate learning enhancer. Okay, let's jump right in. Section 1. The myth of innate talent. Let's start by confronting a really deeply ingrained societal illusion, which is this pervasive idea that raw, innate talent dictates our ceiling for success. So you've probably heard of the 10,000-hour rule, right? It was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell. It's this idea that just putting 10,000 hours into literally anything makes you a master. But actually, scratch that. This is wildly misunderstood. The original research by psychologist Anders Ericsson found that it takes 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, not just casual mindless repetition. If you do the exact same thing for 10,000 hours with zero feedback and no conscious effort to improve, you're going to see minimal improvement. You basically just become an absolute expert at being exactly as good as you already are. And this brings us right to psychologist Carol Dweck's foundational work. We so often operate with what she calls a fixed mindset. That's the belief that our abilities are just innate and static. You have what you're born with. But contrast that with a growth mindset, which is the belief that abilities can actually be developed over time. People with a growth mindset, they persist longer, they actively seek out critical feedback, and ultimately, they just achieve far more. And honestly, the most beautiful part of Dweck's research, this growth mindset itself isn't some genetic trait. It can absolutely be actively learned and adopted by anyone watching this explainer right now. Moving right along to Section 2, the biology of still. Let's look at the physical reality of learning and see how this actually builds in the brain. Because we aren't just talking about abstract psychology here. We're talking about literal biological changes, specifically myelin. Think of myelin as the insulation wrapping around a copper electrical wire. When you practice repetitively, this myelin sheath around your neural pathways actually thickens. And as it thickens, the electrical signals in your brain travel so much faster and way more efficiently. So what this really means is that when you practice, physical and cognitive skills literally become biologically wired into your brain's architecture. Skill is quite literally insulation. Which brings us to Section 3, the deliberate practice framework. Now that we know we need to build that myelin, we have to look at how to actually do it efficiently. This brings us back to Anders Ericsson's concept of deliberate practice. It perfectly explains why, say, a musician who practices their scales slowly and attentively is going to improve vastly faster than one who just plays fast and sloppy. So the absolutely crucial point here is that time spent is not the most important predictor of skill development. Practice quality is. You really must apply these 4 components to whatever skill you're trying to learn. First, you need highly specific goals, not just, oh, I want to get better. Second, you need full, undivided concentration. Third, you must have immediate feedback so you can correct mistakes instantly. And fourth, you gotta repeatedly refine your weaknesses. If your practice session is missing even one of these 4 elements, well, it simply isn't deliberate practice. All right, Section 4, hacks for long-term retention. So, okay, we know how to practice. But how do we make sure we don't just forget everything we learned the very next day? Let's look at this really fascinating concept called desirable difficulty. It turns out making learning feel slightly harder in the moment actually accelerates your long-term memory. Take a look at this comparison between interleaving and blocking. Blocking is when you practice one thing repeatedly, like AAA, then BBB. Interleaving mixes it up, ABC, ABC. Medical schools actually use problem-based learning that relies heavily on interleaving. If students practice mixed types of problems, their immediate performance actually drops because, well, it feels a lot harder. But when it comes time for the actual test, the interleaved students drastically outperform the block students. The struggle of constantly switching gears literally forces the brain to lock that information in. Then we have the spacing effect, reviewing material at increasing intervals, so one day, then maybe 3 days, then a week. This exploits the brain's natural forgetting curve. Language apps like Duolingo use spaced repetition so brilliantly, they essentially force you to review a vocabulary word right at the exact moment your brain is about to forget it. Hitting that near forgetting state tells the brain, oh wait, hold on, I still need this, which makes the memory so much more durable. And this perfectly illustrates the testing effect. Did you know that active recall practice, which means actually testing yourself and forcing your brain to reconstruct the knowledge, that outperforms passive rereading by a factor of 2 to 3 times when it comes to long-term retention? Seriously, 2 to 3 times. Just reading your notes over and over? It's a total illusion of competence. Quizzing yourself is where the real learning actually happens. Moving on to Section 5, building better mental models. As we start shifting from simple memorization to true mastery, it is absolutely crucial to realize that experts don't just know a giant list of disconnected facts. Instead, experts organize their knowledge into these dense, highly connected mental models. One way to actually do this is through what's called first principles thinking, where you learn exactly why something works at its very core, rather than just memorizing a rule. And when you do this, you achieve a transfer of learning. This is when skills magically transfer between seemingly totally unrelated domains that happen to share a deep structure. It is exactly why a chess player's advanced pattern recognition can aid in military strategy, or why a musician's highly trained ear makes them just incredible at learning new spoken languages. Now, if you want to build these models quickly, use the Feynman technique. Named after the brilliant physicist Richard Feynman, this technique is just brutally simple. You try to explain the concept as if you were talking to a child. The very moment you stumble or rely on jargon or get confused yourself, boom, you've immediately exposed a gap in your own understanding. And that exact gap is your cue to go right back to the source material. It completely destroys the illusion of knowledge and helps you build these rock-solid mental models. And finally, Section 6, the ultimate learning enhancer. Let's look at the absolute final piece of the puzzle. Because you can have the best mental models, the best spaced repetition, and the most deliberate practice in the world, but without this next element, your hard work is literally wasted. I'm talking about sleep. Memory consolidation during sleep is where your learning is literally saved to your hard drive. If you decide to pull an all-nighter to learn something, you are effectively erasing much of the day's learning. Science shows us time and time again that sleep immediately following a study session is the single most important variable for long-term retention, period. Without sleep, that biological process of thickening the myelin we talked about earlier, it simply cannot complete its work. But as you embark on this accelerated learning journey, I really want to leave you with a fascinating warning about who you actually ask for help. It's a phenomenon called expert blindness, or sometimes the curse of knowledge. As someone becomes a world-class expert, their mental models become so incredibly dense and automatic that they literally forget what it feels like to not know the basics. What this means in practice is that a world-class grandmaster often makes a significantly worse teacher for a day one beginner than just an intermediate player would. So seek out guides who actually still remember the struggle. Well, we've covered the biology, the methods, and the mindsets. You've got the blueprint now. The whole myth of innate talent, consider it completely busted. So I want to leave you with a bit of a challenge. What is one specific skill that you are going to deliberately practice this week? Remember to define your specific goal, keep that full focus, and create a really tight feedback loop. Get a good night's sleep, for sure, and just see how incredibly fast you can truly learn. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and happy learning.